Welcome to the Behavior Speak podcast. Now, here's your host, Ben Ryman.
Welcome to another episode of the Behavior Speak podcast. I'm your host, Ben Ryman, as always. Today, another exciting episode. We have Dr. Natalia Baires here. She's going to be sharing some of her research. Dr. Baires is, I'm actually speculating here. I don't actually know what I'm saying, but she hasn't, I don't think she's been doing a lot of research, but the research that she's put out already is really amazing. And I think it's really a sign of, I think, of some really good stuff kind of to come. When sort of 3 out of 4 of the papers, are really powerful and hard hitting, it bodes well for our field. And it's just wonderful to see, more and more young Ph.Ds in our field coming in, and just doing some really neat work on some really important stuff. And what I particularly like is, we're going to be talking about some research, at least one that was published in Behavior Analysis and Practice. And what I really like about that journal in particular, and I'm not here to sort of pump it up, but is when they publish articles that give you, really, really good sort of, an action plan at the end. And Dr. Baires' articles do just that, give you sort of concrete kind of steps on things you can do to kind of really make a difference, for the folks you're working or for the field. And we're going to be talking about sort of both those areas. So welcome to the show.
Well, thank you for that very nice introduction. I'm glad to be here. And yeah, I'm glad to, we'll talk about, I know you mentioned a couple of my articles, and so happy to discuss all those.
Super cool. So Natalia, before we kind of get into, some of this really cool research, maybe we can kind of get a bit of an idea of kind of how you got to that point. And so I'd like to kind of hear a little bit of the origin story. Kind of how did you get into the field of ABA, and sort of how did you get to and sort of the point of kind of doing the work you're doing now?
Well, I stumbled upon ABA by accident. In my senior year of my undergrad, I actually intended to go the marriage and family therapist route. And it was my senior year, and I had to take a class in that, and they weren't going to offer it. And the only class available was an introduction to ABA class. So I enrolled in that, and I really loved the content, what I was learning in there. I learned just a lot of the principles, but it really got me curious about the field. And I think that's what I was really looking for all along. I think for a while I had been interested in why people behave, but never stumbled upon kind of this approach as to, explain why people behave certain ways. So I graduated with my bachelor's in psychology and Chicano studies, which is Mexican American studies. And I took a year off and decided to just work kind of in the fields. And I say that because I wasn't working in like an ABA setting.
Right.
I was working with at an after-school program, a day rehab program for children with emotional and behavioral disorders. And cool. I think there were a couple of kids there on the spectrum. And so we had, I think the youngest were maybe like 5-year-olds, and then the oldest were, I think, up to 12. And so I was there for about a year, and I decided to apply to grad school. I got in at Cal State Los Angeles, and I graduated there with a Master's of Science in Counseling and an emphasis in ABA. So that was pretty cool, because we actually, as part of our requirements, had to take a couple of classes in counseling. So we got an opportunity to kind of play the counselor role and learn kind of those, quote, soft skills that behavior analysts don't really learn.
Totally.
Yeah. So I went there. I did my thesis with Dr. Mitch Freiling. And the thesis was on observational learning and seeing whether children with autism, if they observe people engaging in errors while they're learning a new task, if that makes a difference with the children's performance in relation to like observational learning. So that was my master's. And then the last year of my master's, that's when I really got into working in the field. So I got my first job I think back then we didn't really have the RBT. I think it did exist, but it wasn't as, I guess, prevalent as it is now. So I worked as a behavior therapist for a year, and then I sat for the exam, took on a supervisory role, and I had wanted to do my PhD. I had mentioned that to my advisor, and I was kind of like, should I do it or where should I go? I think that was one of the bigger, kind of things for me is like, where do I go? Because in California, there aren't really PhD programs in behavior analysis. And I kind of wanted to stay home.
Great.
And so eventually I just really like cast my net wide and applied just to various schools outside of the state.
Yeah.
And so I took 2 years off between my master's and my PhD, and I got accepted into Southern Illinois. It was before when I started, it was a PhD in rehabilitation with a focus on behavior analysis and therapy. And so I started off working under the advisement of Dr. Ruth Ann Rayfelt.
Okay.
Who is a big researcher in RFT and acceptance and commitment training and derived relation responding. So I started off with her, and then I had to switch advisors because she took on a different, like an administrative role. And so I finished with a PhD in psychology because then we moved, our program moved to the psychology department. And so I have a PhD in psychology with an option in behavior analysis and therapy. And I worked under Dr. Darwin Shane Koch, who was not a behavior analyst. He was actually a rehab counselor. So I learned a lot of different things from him, right? Like I didn't really, I guess, learn behavior analysis, so to speak, from him, but I think that's contributed to, kind of the work that I'm doing and how I teach my students and so forth. So I think that's my story in a nutshell.
Yeah, and he passed away recently. Is that right?
Yeah, he did. He passed away in May. So that was really, hard on our lab.
Yeah.
But yeah, he did pass away recently.
Sorry for your loss.
Yeah, thank you.
So I love his origin story. So a lot of the origin stories we get on here, and this is by no means a slam to these folks, but they're often kind of the same. They're often undergrad in some random field, sees a job board because they need to make some extra money, and it's often, like you said, an RBT, behavior therapist kind of gig. And that's what gets them into it, working with kids. And then they kind of just go that whole sort of, master's and PhD and ABA route. I liked first off that your initial sort of idea was to go and become a marriage and family therapist. I like this for a couple of reasons. One, I just first off, and I was kind of touching on before we chat, just how calm your voice kind of comes off is, and I could really see that in a counselor. Like, I think you'd be a great counselor just for that piece alone. And I think that for me, that's what draws it in. They're a good counselor if they've got a really chill, mellow voice, and it doesn't really matter to me what skills they have. They just have to have a chill, mellow voice. So you got that piece going, which is wicked. But it's interesting, just as sort of as kind of coming full circle, that you got into your PhD. Is that where was Southern Illinois where you kind of first got introduced to ACT, or was that before that?
Actually, I got introduced to ACT during my master's in our second year. I think it was like, I don't know, it was like a special, like a capstone course or something.
Sure.
And the topic changes every year. And Dr. Michelle Wallace, who taught, I was enrolled in her section of the course, they decided to do ACT, and they actually had Dr. Tom Szabo come to class, and then Dr. Adele Najowski come to class.
Wow. And
I think someone else, I forget who it was, but I remember, I think I remember just thinking like, what is this? Like, this is not what I guess thought I'd be doing in my master's in behavior analysis. But yeah, they gave us opportunity to kind of practice some of the, I guess exercises that are commonly used in ACT. So that's where I first got introduced to ACT. And I remember also, like, in our verbal behavior class, towards the end of the quarter, we got introduced to RFT.
Of course.
But I didn't know, or relational frame theory, right? And so I didn't really understand what it was. Like, all I remember like being told was RFT is like stimulus equivalence. But I learned that that's not the case, afterwards in my PhD. So yeah, I think I got introduced early on into these two areas.
The reason I ask is I know you kind of went on, you talked about this in one of the presentations you did that was related to your dissertation about sort of the and this is something that comes up a lot, is the difference between, acceptance and commitment therapy and acceptance and commitment training. And that, behavior analysts tend to sort of practice the latter. And that's kind of where the research is. But we do see, it is quite common these days to find a marriage and family therapist practicing acceptance commitment therapy. So it would have been interesting for you to kind of go that route. And I wonder if you would have come in contact with ACT anyway, and, still possibly been doing the same kind of work. Who knows?
Yeah. And I will say, though, that I think, like, it must have been in my second year. I don't know why, but I was interested in, like, I guess, maybe not switching, but kind of combining my master's. So it was like a focus on an MFT and an ABA focus. And I think I remember telling the faculty, the ABA faculty, and I think they looked at me like, "What? Why? You're switching to the dark side," kind of. And I decided to stay where I was, because I think when I was taking the verbal behavior class, I was getting really curious about, kind of our private events and private thoughts and how that influences our behavior. So I think that's where my kind of curiosity of going to the other side was coming out. Yeah.
That's funny. The other side. It's not the other side. It's the same side.
Yeah.
But what another piece that I really liked, and like, I think it really looks like you did all the right things, I think, when it comes to sort of, starting out in this field. Like, I think you made a brilliant decision. And you touched on this when you were telling us your story, to take a degree in counseling, because I think you're so right that we are so lacking in what should be, our one of our main skills as behavior analysts, working with people, is having these kind of people counseling skills, compassionate care skills. We had a chapter conference last year for our British Columbia ABBA chapter, and we brought in Bridget Taylor to talk about her work, her recent kind of work that she's been talking quite a lot about compassionate care. And I said this on another episode, how ridiculous it was to me that in 2021 or in 2020, we're now realizing that a good bedside manner is important in our field. And it sort of speaks, I think, a lot to sort of, and we won't necessarily go down a lot of these roads, but it speaks a lot about, some of these conversations around kind of ABA reform and those sorts of things. And I think that's a big piece that I think has been missing in ABA for a lot of years, is giving folks the skills to sort of, engage other human beings and develop a relationship, and, and be compassionate and have good listening skills, which we're going to touch on in one of your papers. And so, I just give extra kudos and extra sorts of, bows of honor or whatever to folks that take a counseling degree, as they kind of work through this field, because I think it just makes such a huge difference.
Yeah, agreed.
And so really cool. That was a really neat kind of intro and kind of how you kind of got into things. So from your kind of work with Dr. Freiling and kind of observational learning, and now you've put out sort of 3 articles over the last few years, in particular, that I've been drawn to. And we're going to talk about an article that talks about racism. We're going to talk about an article that talks about sexism. And we're going to talk about an article that talks about, incorporating kind of, being kind of more culturally conscious, I guess, when we're, kind of creating interventions. I think, and these are all huge, important areas, I think, for us as behavior analysts to learn and to kind of really kind of look at changing our practices. And again, I think a lot of this also fits into this sort of bigger sort of umbrella of kind of reforming our field and kind of uh, advancing and learning and growing. The advent of George Floyd and kind of Black Lives Matter, I think really brought, and I think everyone has said this now, it really brought a lot more of these topics to light, and people really want to hear about this stuff now and learn about this stuff, which I think is amazing. But a little late in the game.
But yeah, definitely, we have a long way to go.
Yeah,
too.
absolutely. It's we're just like tip of the iceberg. There's a couple of lines in one of your articles where I think you talk about sort of great things that behavior analysts could be doing to sort of improve some of these things, but nobody has yet. And it's a first step to kind of recognize those things, but now we actually got to start doing them, and so it's just really cool that you have. I guess we could kind of maybe start talking about these sort of I guess in the order you did them, because I think on some level they are interrelated, and so maybe we'll kind of talk a little bit about your thesis, your dissertation first. Let's get these terms mixed up. And the lowly master's student I was. So for your dissertation, you did, as you kind of just told me sort of before the episode started, you did kind of three studies within it that were basically looking at traditional ways of kind of providing behavior intervention to autistic kids in these Latinx families, and we won't kind of dive deep into sort of the materials and methods and whatnot. Natalia did a great presentation for the Dissemination for Behavior Analysis Special Interest Group, and they have a YouTube channel, and we'll put the link in the show notes. And it's just a nice hour presentation, kind of on some of the work in her dissertation, and we'll kind of go into that in more detail. But I do want to ask some questions about kind of about this paper. But before we kind of get into that, maybe you could just kind of tell us why you decided to do this as your dissertation.
That's a good question. I think I was just pulling from, so I guess maybe I'll start off with this, and then that'll guide me to actually answering your question. Because I'm trying to do this more often now when I speak about these topics, is I disclose, what identities I identify with, because I feel that right is important.
Okay.
Because it relates, it ties to, some of my lived experiences as a human in this world, and as a behavior analyst in this field. So I do identify as, and I'm happy to explain the terms if you think the listeners are maybe unsure of what some of the terms mean. But I identify as a cisgender woman, so I identify with the sex I was assigned as at birth. I identify as a female. I also identify as a woman of color, specifically Latina. My parents are both immigrated from Central America, and so my mom is from Guatemala and my dad is from El Salvador, and so grew up in that kind of immigrant Latino household. And I speak Spanish, so I'm bilingual. I can read, write, speak Spanish. And what else? I think those are kind of maybe the main ones. And I guess I should also disclose that, I identify as heterosexual, and I also identify as non-disabled, because I feel like that also, impacts maybe what I'm focusing on and the areas that I can be focusing on or, considering. So I, with that being said, when I first started working in the field, I actually worked for an agency owned by two BCBA-Ds that are from Colombia. And I remember stumbling upon that agency and thinking, wow, this is really cool. Like, I want to work for them. I don't think I've ever seen that. And so, and I was born and raised in Los Angeles. And so I think almost maybe like 95% of the clients that I had were Spanish speaking. I rarely had English speaking clients because there was just a huge need for Spanish speaking families to provide services for them. And so I worked with also a lot of immigrant families. And so I think when it came time for my dissertation, I thought, well, this is something, kind of reflecting back on my experiences as a behavior therapist and as a supervisor, reflecting on maybe some of the unique challenges or experiences that this population has. And just kind of looking at the field of that maybe we don't consider language and culture enough in the services we provide, or even with the students we mentor and supervise, or the supervisees. It just it's not just with the families that we serve, but so that's where my idea came. And I think I stumbled upon a book that talked about I think cultural, what's it called? Mindfulness and acceptance in multicultural competency. And so I think that's where I got the idea of, how can I adapt acceptance and commitment training for maybe caregivers of autistic individuals? And then I guess that's where kind of my idea just blossomed of, well, in the Latino culture, family is, and I'm sure this is seen across other cultures too, but I guess how it's the behaviors associated with that value are different, right? So in the Latino culture, like, family is super important. Like, my mom has even told me this. She's like, if it were up to me, like, you and your brother would never move out, until you got married, kind of thing. And so, it's very important in our culture. And so I thought, well, I think it would be really cool to have 3 studies, because we had to have a minimum of 2 studies. And so I decided to just do 3. One focusing on autistic children, Latino autistic children. The second focusing on the parents or caregivers of autistic Latino children. And then the last one focusing on the siblings of autistic Latino children. So that kind of everyone in the family, kind of, I don't know, for lack of a better word, get something.
That's awesome. And you mentioned that one of these, before we started recording, that one of these is going to be published soon?
Yes. So the one that from the dissemination of behavior analysis SIG, that recording that you mentioned. So that second study with the caregivers will be published, and it'll be, I'm trying to remember the name of the book, but it'll be published in a book that I think is going to tentatively be called Psychology and COVID-19 in the Americas, because my co-author, Sebastian Garcia Zambrano, who is a doctoral candidate at Southern Illinois University, he mentioned that there was this conference in Spanish, and he's like, we should submit your dissertation and see if you can present it. So that was that was last year, my first conference presenting in Spanish, which was very nerve-wracking for me. Thankfully, I just had to record it. I didn't have to do it live. Yeah, but so the people who were chosen to present at that conference had the opportunity to submit their work to be considered for this book. And so, yeah.
That's amazing. Before we kind of jump into, because most kind of the reading that I did and then I watched that DBA SIG was on kind of the work you did with parents. I'm curious, with the study with the children, was that also an ACT adaptation, or were you actually adapting sort of just traditional standard kind of EI/BI stuff?
It was not ACT focused. It was more on derived relational responding and kind of language and verbal behavior. Because what I tried to do is I tried to recruit participants who lived in a bilingual household, and so that they weren't as proficient in Spanish. And so what I tried to do is I tried to teach them certain like words of relational frames. And so I guess to put it simply, I tried to teach them how to identify the words same, opposite, and different in Spanish.
Okay.
Using the English words. And so I taught that with stimuli. So I would try to incorporate culturally kind of sensitive stimuli. So for instance, with food, I would ask at intake, I asked the caregiver kind of what are the common foods that you eat in your household that might be specific to, your culture. And so I use those stimuli, for example, in my dissertation to teach those frames.
Okay. And now is that something, I don't have a lot of familiarity with, verbal behavior sort of training for kids in general, let alone sort of that use of RFT, although it's starting to make more and more sense as I learn more about it every day. How is sort of what you did different than what folks generally do?
I think maybe generally people tend to just focus on the English language and don't really maybe consider or ask, well, what other languages do you speak in the household, or what other, like languages does your child or speak or is exposed to? Because I think I'm trying to think of my participants. I think and I interacted mainly with the mothers. They at least were at least monolingual Spanish speakers, and I think they understood maybe a little bit of English. So I think that has a lot of significance, social significance, in that household. If the child can't communicate with those in the household who only speak a certain language, then it cuts off a lot of communication, right? And other ways to connect. So.
If you're planning on collecting continuing education credits for this episode, you'll need to know the 3 secret words and enter them at www.cbiconsultants.com/shop. The first secret word is utopia. And this is sort of a little off topic, and again, it just sort of speaks just to my sort of general ignorance of teaching young children. I primarily come from a adult sort of background and working with adult clients and whatnot. Try to word this the right way. I'm not looking for you to sort of start slamming folks, but I'm wondering kind of. There's a lot of sort of these, sort of protocols kind of out there. There's ABLES and VBMAP and PEAK and all the and some of these other things, which are all I think have different value. Do those sorts of protocols, which have been around, a lot of them, maybe not so much PEAK, but the other ones have been around for quite a long time. I guess Essentials for Living or another one, and ones like the life skills type curriculum. Do those curricula, and maybe you don't know because you don't work with them, and then that's okay too. But I'm wondering if those curricula tend to be sort of more kind of Eurocentric, and that the goals of them tend to be kind of more on sort of what the typical sort of white family might look like versus whatever. Did you know?
I want to say that is the case.
Yeah.
I don't think I've read maybe the kind of the normative sample that they used, right, in the initial kind of development of those curricula, but I do want to say that it's probably, I don't know, I'm guessing that probably even maybe the children who were included in those samples were like their race and ethnicity and languages probably weren't even reported, which is an issue. And so like I think even with like the VB-MAP or just any curricular assessment that focuses on language, they may translate things into different languages, but that doesn't mean that it's culturally adapted. So what I mean by that is that, so for example, in Spanish, and I can't think of any examples, but in Spanish, there's just certain sounds that we use that English speakers use. And so to assess for that, to translate, right, and assess for that same skill doesn't make sense for someone who is a Spanish speaker who is, speaks another language besides English.
Yes.
Or even like if the curricular or the assessment have a currency, it's probably going to be US dollars.
Right.
I don't think it's going to be, we're going to see the Canadian dollar in there or, like other different types of, currency in there.
Yeah.
And so why do children or individuals who are administered these assessments have to know that if that is not relevant for their life? So.
Well, and I think that's a great point. And again, to sort of the authors of those, sort of curricula, we don't know we're just speculating here, but maybe it's something to look into. And I've also sort of heard suggestions about, some of these curricula, and again, digressing a bit here, but not really taking into account sort of all the pieces of, I think, of kind of intersectionality and sort of, gender diversity and sort of all those areas. And so I think, and this isn't really about sort of changing everything right now, but, I think just sort of speaks to the fact that, a lot of the stuff that we have in place, a lot of the curricula, the assessments, the programs, the interventions or whatever, they're probably all lacking in some way with these things, and I think you make a really good point. Don't make the assumption that sort of just because something's been translated into another language that it's now culturally appropriate for that group. Yeah. So kind of looking at sort of the parent work that you were doing, and around kind of cultural kind of adaptations. I thought there were some neat things, and again, I don't know if this stuff was necessarily in the paper or more in the presentation that I saw that kind of was talking about that paper, but you talked about a few different things kind of right from the beginning in the presentation that I think were really important for folks, and a bit of a wake-up call for me. And this is sort of around things like appropriation, and cultural appropriation is something that I'm learning more and more about sort of every day, and kind of the different forms of that. I mean, for us up here in Canada, the most popular examples, I think, are kind of around, the use of, kind of as it relates to sort of our Indigenous population, and kind of engaging in some of those activities, whether it be wearing a sort of a headband with feathers in it, or dressing in a garb, or a dream catcher or whatnot, and sort of just kind of making it their own without sort of considering some of those pieces. But I really thought it was interesting that you talked about sort of the idea of you were kind of going through and explaining the sort of the six sort of pieces of the items there in the hexaflex, and you were talking about how we shouldn't, because this happens all the time, how we shouldn't use present moment awareness and mindfulness interchangeably. Can you just touch on that a little bit?
Yeah, and I will say that this is something that I'm learning from colleagues who come from the populations, because mindfulness, I guess, so I don't know, I'm stumbling on my words right now, but I guess I just want to just make it known that I'm not the person, the go-to person, and this is just something that I'm learning and trying to disseminate as I talk about my work, because I think it is important.
That's fair.
And so I'm learning from a couple of my colleagues who are from India that equating present moment awareness and mindfulness is cultural appropriation because they're not the same thing. And I think in the literature, that's how it's been presented, for a long time. And I think it still is being presented that way. But I guess, when someone kind of uses the term synonymously, it'd be best to just say, hey, they're not the same thing. And again, I feel like I'm kind of butchering this opportunity to really talk about this, but because what my colleagues have told me is that there isn't really a precise definition of mindfulness, but there are just differences. And, people can reach out to my colleagues. I think they'd be okay with me saying their names if that's okay with you.
Please.
Yeah, so Amrinder Babra, and he actually goes by Binda. Babra, he is a doctoral candidate at Southern Illinois University, and then my other colleague is Manish Goyal. He's also a doctoral candidate at Southern Illinois University. So, yeah,
cool.
That's where I'm learning from them.
Good. I appreciate that, and I didn't sort of prep you for this question prior, and you're right that we definitely should be kind of going to the source to get that information. And I'm not looking for you to give me give me a definition of mindfulness, but I think it's just interesting that there's a lot of these pieces that we just don't consider. And another thing you kind of touched on was around sort of the kind of the connection. The connection between Buddhism and ACT, and how maybe we're stealing a bit from there too, and not recognizing that sort of piece, and that the idea that there might even be some cultural and racial bias, in ACT itself, and it would be great for you to touch on kind of the metaphor piece, especially that chess metaphor. I thought that was such an interesting story. That's really cool. But before you do that, can you just explain really more for me? Most of our listeners probably know more about this than I do, but what is this whole idea of using metaphor in ACT? I don't understand sort of how that works.
So ACT relies kind of the foundation for ACT is relational frame theory. And so I think that's where this emphasis on metaphors comes in, because we can, the language plays a huge role in metaphors of, like in relational frame theory, there's these different frames or relational, frames of sameness, stimuli are the same, how stimuli are viewed as opposite or distinct or in a hierarchy. And so in a metaphor, I think all those kind of frames activate when we're using metaphors. And so people can derive things that way. So I think that's where kind of the emphasis on metaphors comes in with ACT.
Yeah, actually, that does make sense. Okay, no, that's cool. Because okay, cool. All the stuff I've been learning about ACT and RFT, just for the listeners, has been very basic and very sort of kind of foundational stuff. And I'm still sort of struggling to sort of comprehend the real world applications, especially when it comes to sort of teaching verbal behavior and those things. And I don't want you to explain that to me right now, but I hear a lot of references to metaphor. And so kind of going back to sort of that original question, you talk about a metaphor that's often used in ACT is this thing called the chess metaphor. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, the chessboard metaphor. Yeah. So I actually read that in that book I mentioned earlier, titled Mindfulness and Acceptance in Multicultural Competency by Dr. Aki Masuda. And when I read that part of the book, I was like, oh my gosh, like this makes sense now how they explain it. So the chessboard metaphor is you basically, when you're doing it, you tell the person that, there's this chessboard and that their thoughts, their good thoughts are the white pieces of the chessboard. And their bad thoughts, or their unhelpful thoughts, how I like to call them, are the black pieces. And so I just like, if we're in the context of race, like it just is just like, okay, well, white people equal good, black people equal bad is kind of what is, I guess, maybe the underlying message there. Totally. And so I don't know. I think I said this in that presentation too for the DBA SIG of like people from different backgrounds. Like, I guess if people from the same backgrounds are always coming up with these things, metaphors and all these things, they're not accounting for people who don't identify with their own backgrounds, right? So maybe if there was, because I know like Steve Hayes, right, and kind of Kelly Wilson and all them are kind of came up with ACT, but maybe if we had some Black or African American, people part of that wouldn't have kind of made the cut, so to speak. And just even I did a similar presentation, I think earlier this year, to a group of clinical psychology students, and we were speaking about kind of common exercises and metaphors in ACT, and someone in this, I didn't realize this, and this speaks to my, I guess my experience of being non-disabled, of even the use of maybe music is not accommodating or accessible, right, for people who are hard of hearing. And so that's like, wow, that totally makes sense. And that's something that I didn't realize. But, it's things like that we're not considering, and it's not being made accessible to everyone.
Oh, really cool. Yeah, really good point. It's, and of course we're taking a snapshot and pulling out sort of one thing here, but it does seem bizarrely odd that no one picked up on that one.
Yeah.
If it was a checkerboard, sure, maybe you could start to, have to think it through a little more. But black bad, white good. Wow. That's amazing. Well, hopefully folks out there listening are thinking about those things a little more now after that. I won't go too much more into kind of those studies, because again, I think folks, I'm going to put a link to that presentation you did. It's only an hour long. It's really succinct and has some really great visuals that kind of paint the picture really well. I'm going to recommend it to a few folks just to watch, because I think it's a really nice sort of introduction to pieces there. But just looking at kind of our time, and I really want to kind of jump into a couple of these other articles, ones that are available. And so I think maybe we'll start with the sexism article, and we'll finish with the most recent racism article. And so this article that you put out is called The Future is Female, and then in brackets, and behavior analysis. It's a behavioral account of sexism, and I think it may go on a little more.
Yeah, it's me and my long titles. Yeah, so it's called The Future is Female, parentheses, and behavior analysis, a behavioral account of sexism and how behavior analysis is simultaneously part of the problem and solution.
Yeah. So here's another really, I think, a really powerful and important article for a couple of reasons for me. One, I think just, obviously the title and the obvious need to sort of address sexism in the world and in our field is obvious. But I think, or maybe actually it's not obvious, or we probably would have done something by now. But the title makes it stand out pretty obvious. But what I liked about this article, and I think especially for someone like myself who is a man, I think I really encourage men in particular to read this article, because it really I find it really does a really good job of number one, kind of right away scrapping some of these myths of kind of how feminism is perceived. I think you give a great example of in the article of sort of people looking at feminism as just being sort of essentially about lesbianism mostly,
right.
And that's all it was ever about, and there was no other point to it. But feminism is just I think maybe for other folks, I think it could also be called anti-sexism, in the same way sort of we have anti-racism. I mean, if feminism means eliminating sexism, and I think I saw that line in the article, and that was just such a simple, elegant, sort of perfect definition of kind of what that's all about. And it's not about sort of
yeah, it's like not about. It's not about like a group of women just like hanging out, burning their bras, right? Like how we, right?
Yeah,
yeah. It's trying to engage in behaviors, right, that try to ensure kind of all these social, economic, and political rights for all genders, not just people who identify as female. Yeah,
absolutely. And another piece I really like about this article is that it points out examples of kind of other research in our field, that because a lot of people think, because with the advent of George Floyd and previous to that, things like Me Too and Time's Up and sort of these other sorts of things that have been kind of coming out more and more in terms of social justice and awareness, that that spurred all these folks to start doing this work. But I mean, certainly we know that there's been lots of work in feminism for years, but sort of in our field. But you point out in the article a bunch of examples of research and articles that folks have done over many decades on sort of this issue. So this is not a new issue in behavior analysis. Kind of my first kind of question is, well, before I ask something, the other thing I really like about this article is the headings, the sort of the subheadings in the article I think are just awesome. Smashing the patriarchy is one. Like, that's just not something you're going to see in a scientific article. Sexism hits home.
The F word, feminism. That one's my favorite.
The F word. Yeah, that's brilliant. And kudos to the editors for sort of letting you, publish a paper with those titles. But I like to first kind of talk about sort of maybe if you could talk a little bit about sort of this first article that you reference a few times that goes all the way back to 1978, talking about a little bit about some of this stuff. This article by Holland. And you kind of just to talk about it being a bit of a controversial article. Can you talk a little bit about that paper?
Yeah, my paper on sexism actually stemmed, and this is where I read the Holland article in a radical behaviorism class that I was taking at Southern Illinois University for my Ph.D. And so I remember reading this Holland article, where they basically speak about how behavior analysis has all these principles and kind of technology, quote, and tools at our disposal, but we're not using it, especially for behaviors at the cultural level. So groups of people and, how they behave. And so I remember reading that and I was just so, I don't know, I guess impressed. I don't know if that's the right word, but it really stuck out to me, that article. And I think that's where my idea for the sexism article stemmed from. We have all these things in our field. We know how to shape behavior, how to punish behavior, right, when it's needed. Put behavior on extinction. We have all these things, but we're not using it for at home in our own field, which is a problem. I think as a field, we might tend to just be concerned with the behavior of others, but not our own behavior, especially in the field. And so this is why things like sexism and racism are still prevalent, I guess, in the world and also in our field. But so, yeah, that was kind of the main idea of the Holland article. I think they were speaking about how, I think even for individuals who are incarcerated, and I apologize, maybe that's not the most sensitive language. I try to, be aware of, the language that I use to speak about certain populations. But how, they're put in that environment, right, of confinement, and they lose access to all these reinforcers. And then when they get out, the world hasn't changed. The environment hasn't changed to maintain the behaviors that they've maybe kind of learned. I don't know. Right. While, in prison or in jail. And that's, kind of a shortcoming of our field is those kinds of things, is we're not setting up people for success by, and are rearranging our environments and mediating reinforcement for, the behaviors that we do want to see. So I guess that, kind of ties to sexism of, I haven't checked the stats, the demographics recently, but, the BACB does have data on the demographics of behavior of RBTs, BCBAs, and BCBA-Ds, right, who just self-report. But our field is comprised mostly of people who identify as female, white females. So, that, I mean, I don't know, that could be, I think that also kind of relates to, right, the racism article that I have. But I mean, even as females, we can engage in sexism towards one another. I mean, I think we're the worst probably at doing it to one another. I've experienced it. I'm pretty sure I've perpetuated that. And so, just because we come from that population that is impacted by sexism doesn't mean we're not we have kind of an excuse of, oh, well, I can't engage in it because I'm part of, that group.
Yeah. Well, and you great points. And you kind of speak on all those points in this article. That going back to that Holland article, just for folks, the article is titled "Behaviorism: Part of the Problem or Part of the Solution," and essentially, I think what James Holland is talking about in this article is kind of the idea that, and this is 1978, so you got to sort of think of the times, but I think a lot of this still applies. Is that behavior analysts often focus on fixing the person instead of fixing the context. Back then, and this really speaks to kind of I think in sort of more kind of layman's terms, we're talking about victim blaming,
yeah,
right? And victim blaming is become is a hugely a hugely sexist action that we engage in. I think the classic example would be rape, and that she should have she was asking for it, she was dressed the wrong way, or she was looking at the person the wrong way, or she was flirting, so that means and so on and so forth, and so it was her fault that she got raped, which we know has gone so far systemically to be embedded into law now, and judges have said that to women, in court, that that why were you wearing that, and when those questions just should never be asked. So it's for sure it's deeply embedded, and I can see why in 1978 this was controversial. It's interesting. I as an aside, I kind of would like to look up James Holland and see if he continued to publish after that article. Because I've never heard that name beyond that one. You talk about one thing that I think is a bit of a wake up call for folks, for men. Again, I think not for folks, but for men. Kind of going back to your stat, I think the stat in your paper referred to it being like 82% female was our field, and you're right, it's probably even higher now. But that the heading of Sexism Hits Home refers to several kind of well-known female behavior analysts talking about with articles that talk about, on some level, their experiences with sexism in our own field. And the one that I think really kind of hit home for me was the Linda LeBlanc reference, where you mentioned in the article that she in her 2015 paper, she references older male behavior analysts engaging in inappropriate interactions with younger female behavior analysts.
Yeah,
that's something that I'd always heard about and experienced a tiny bit when I went to my first ABA conference about I don't know, 10 or 12 years ago, where that was exactly the case, where there were these well-known, older, slightly hero worshipped male behavior analysts, and I'll I can leave the names out for this one, but I think a lot of folks can put it together. Who they are, and surrounded by young women, on their arms, on their shoulders, doing whatever, dancing away, and some of it may have been harmless, I don't know, but you definitely hear a lot about sort of little peeps, whether it be on social media or wherever else, or in these or sort of in these environments, about sort of these really kind of sketchy ways of engaging with folks. And I've also heard of sort of more overt actions, and that the ABBA conferences were essentially in a lot of ways sort of the after party of the ABBA conference, and sort of the problems associated there, which really it sounded to me, and we're talking about graduate level and doctoral level professional human beings engaging in behavior that reminded me of what could have just been a college frat party.
Yeah. I mean, that's what it really is sometimes, to be quite honest, is at conferences, right? Like after the day is done, it's a lot of socializing, right? And maybe there's alcohol involved and,
Yes.
things like that. And I don't know. I mean, I guess looking at it at a behavior analytic perspective, I suppose it would make sense. And so by that, I mean, is if we have maybe a female graduate student who's working with an older, right, male advisor on, maybe she's doing her Ph.D. and, getting good with him or connecting with him, right, means opportunities for her and maybe, promotion to tenure, whatever, right? More publications, more maybe invited presentations, opportunities. It makes sense, right? From a behavior analytic perspective, it makes sense.
Yeah.
But yeah, that is seen a lot.
But like is ABA really no different than Hollywood?
Probably not. No, I don't think so.
Maybe it doesn't require necessarily as overt sexual acts to sort of get invited to the conference. Maybe it does. I mean, I don't know. But it definitely sounds like a young female being sort of willing to tolerate those interactions from the older male in order to not risk a loss of an opportunity.
Right. Yeah, definitely.
Yeah, craziness. And again, speaking to I keep saying this term, this ABA reform, that changes need to happen. That reform is not just about whether whether we used abuse in our field in the old days or still do. It's about so many other components that I think that we just aren't thinking about. Some of these other things, like the idea that you've got that, going back to those stats, so you've got that high percentage of women in the field, low percentage of males, yet most of the published research, if you look at the published research and sort of the levels, and you talk about this a bit in your study, and I think it was Dr. Lee, I think,
Dr. Anita Lee.
And yeah, she's actually coming on the podcast too in a couple of weeks to talk about the paper you referenced in that article, where she talking about sort of the contributions of women to research, and how things like there's not many, you won't find too many articles where if it's a single author that it's a female, or you won't find, or you're more likely to find articles where they have single or multiple females as the primary authors, only if those folks on the editorial boards are women. And then the fact that some of those editorial boards don't have women, or the fact that the research coming out generally isn't published by women because the women don't have the professorship roles or whatever, and sort of chain of kind of things kind of going on. And what this leads to kind of in your article is you start talking about, and this is kind of really nice connection, I think, to your dissertation in terms of the cultural piece, is this idea of that we have an actual kind of culture of sexism and I guess and racism too, I suppose, but the article is speaking more about sexism and feminism. Can you talk a little bit about kind of the behavior analytic interpretation of culture and kind of what it means to have this whole culture of sexism, and then kind of how we can address it? The second secret word is metaphor.
I guess taking from kind of Skinner's definition and thinking of maybe the 3 levels of selection, how there's just there are 3 levels of, I guess, behavior, and how behavior evolves and maintains. And so at the third level, he talks about cultures or like groups of people engaging that share the same practices. And so how maybe culture is transmitted is just in a group, I guess maybe even in behavior analysis. I'm trying to think of an example of, I don't know, maybe even that behavior of, right, maybe those inappropriate interactions with the older, people in power, right? Of how that can be transmitted across generations to, well, this is how this is what I did to kind of advance my career. Maybe this is something you should consider doing. And so, right, that behavior was reinforced for person A. And so it gets transmitted to maybe person B and, across the generations of behavior analysts. And so obviously, punishment, we could see the same with punishment. If behaviors can be punished, if, they obviously stop contact or stimuli are either added or removed, right? And it decreases behavior. So it's just kind of these practices, these group practices that people engage in, and they can, be in relation to gender, race, profession, really anything. And I guess I'm blanking on what the second part of your question was. I'm sorry.
No, it's good. And actually, I'll ask that in a second here, because there's something you kind of touch on too in the article, which I recently had Val Saney on. I don't know if you know him, but he put out a study with he just was primarily, I think, his grad student Hannah Vance. And they put out an article in 2020, which we talked about, called Systemic Racism and Cultural Selection, a preliminary analysis of meta contingencies. And that article was, I think we talked sort of before we turned the interview on how this article you did on sexism, it took me 4 reads to really kind of start grasping some of the topics. His was the same. His probably took me 8 reads because he really dives into this, and I highly recommend folks maybe start looking at some of the work of Sigrid Glenn. And this whole idea of kind of interlocking contingencies and meta contingencies, and words like that can make a non-academic's brain fry. But really, what it's looking at is essentially the reinforcing contingencies of cultures, and how large groups' behavior kind of reinforces each other, and over time kind of creates this. And so you kind of talk about how we've essentially, through these kinds of contingencies, how behavior analytically we've shaped sexism. And I thought that was really interesting, and kind of how and how that all kind of gets reinforced, and folks can kind of read the article to kind of get a little more into that. And with that, you kind of tie in sort of this idea of the waves, the 4 waves of feminism. And I think this is something I think folks would like to hear about, and because it was really interesting to me. I think for me, I always equated feminism with wave 1. And it almost kind of reminded me of sort of what led the labor movement, and kind of what led to sort of the creation of unions and sort of workers' rights and all those sorts of things, and sort of the deep sort of foundational work they had to do to kind of get some equality in the workplace. But nowadays, the activity of a union is so much different. Similarly with feminism, I think, at least in your article, you kind of, and I'm basing this entirely in your article. I have no background in this whatsoever. But can you sort of describe those 4 waves and kind of where we are now?
I will try my best. I will be quite honest. I have my article open right now, exactly on that page that you're referencing.
Good.
But yeah, I mean, there have been different waves of feminism, and I think that we are currently in the 5th one.
Okay.
And so it's just kind of maybe the purpose of feminism has evolved right over time, and how like the behaviors that people have engaged in alignment with feminism have also evolved. So like, for example, the first wave of feminism, it really tried to obtain access to equal opportunities for people who identify as female, through the women's suffrage and kind of rights for education and things like that. And then the second wave shifted a little bit, and it focused on maybe shedding light on oppression and discrimination against people like who are part of the working class. So those included people who identify as Black or African American, or people who identify as women, or people who didn't identify as heterosexual. So I think it's things around there started to emphasize intersectionality a little bit more. And so intersectionality, maybe for people who aren't familiar with the term, is a term coined by Dr. Kimberly Crenshaw. And I think how she coined the term was she spoke about how her experience as a Black woman in the world doesn't really speak about her experience, or being someone who's Black doesn't, I guess, considering how she's someone who identifies as a woman and someone who identifies as Black, and how those two things need to be considered and how they overlap in people's experiences in the world. Because sometimes we may talk about sexism, but we don't talk about sexism as it relates to women of color, because that's a different type of sexism. And, there's this term white feminism of how, like white women are all about equality, but when it comes down to racism, because that's where, right, that kind of women of color kind of, right, component comes in, that that they don't recognize it, or they're not advocating, right, where maybe a female colleague is experiencing racism. It's just it might be seen as two separate things when really they are intertwined.
Yeah, no, that's interesting, because I had it's a good example. I had a guest on recently. It was like episode 22, Jessica Bethel, and she's a Black behavior analyst. And I asked her the question. We're talking about sort of her experiences with racism, so that's kind of how we kind of got into this. And I asked her sort of about her experiences with kind of racism in the field, sort of in her early years. And she said, and what she said to me really kind of reminds me a lot of what you're saying, and really speaks to that intersectionality piece. She said, well, I don't know if I experienced racism or not, because I'm also a woman. And so I don't know if people were discriminating against me because I was Black or because I was a woman. I couldn't tell. And because it wasn't all blatant, and it was more kind of microaggressions, or just, a lack of equality or lack of access to sorts of things. And so I think that's a really important point, is that, it's not just about being a woman. It's not just about being Black, but how those, the intersectionality thing. I think the term intersectionality is something that, maybe I didn't really sort of think about till now. Isn't just, and for everyone out there who's now going duh to me, but it isn't just having multiple identities, but it really is about how they intersect. It's about how, and I think that's what you're kind of, part of what you're kind of trying to say, is that being a Black woman versus being a Latina woman versus being a South Asian woman, completely different experiences, completely different things going on, completely different pieces to consider. Is that
yeah, definitely. I mean, I think maybe as women of color, we may have similar experiences, but they won't ever be the same. And I think that's more so right for Black women. I've in the last year, I've connected a lot. I formed a lot of connections with people who identify as Black women, and I always keep in mind that even though, right, we can relate with certain things in terms of our experiences in the field, I will never know what it feels like to navigate the world in the field as a Black woman, because it's just with anti-Blackness and colorism, right? It's just that that those are different experiences. So yeah, definitely.
Totally. Yeah. before we kind of finish off this article with some action items, there's one other kind of area that I just want to touch on briefly that kind of really again resonated for me, is that sexism there's kind of these two kind of subtypes of sexism, the sort of the hostile versus the benevolent, and the idea, and I think a lot of folks, similar to the kind of the racist conversations and the comparison of sort of direct sort of racist violence and overt sort of negative racist language. There's the folks that have the implicit biases, engage those microaggressions and don't even realize sort of those sorts of things. I feel like this is kind of the parallel, and that hostile sexism refers to sort of me essentially saying women belong in the kitchen. That would be like a hostile direct or rape or anything else. Rape would probably be at the more extreme end. And so I think a lot of folks who think, well, I don't do any of those things, so I'm not sexist. Actually, a lot of them, and I know I was for a lot of my life one of these people that fell into sort of the other pot, the benevolent sexist. And correct me if I'm describing this wrong, but I think, as I understand it, the benevolent sexist is the person, they're not doing any of that kind of overly aggressive stuff. Instead, they're doing things like, I think you had one example, I think, when you're talking about sort of shaping sexism, where, I might, I don't know if you are or not, but let's pretend you're married to a male, and I go up to you and say, you tell me about your something or other, and I say, well, let me talk to your husband about that, because he's the one that knows about cars. That's benevolent sexism, because I'm just assuming you don't know anything about cars because you're a woman, and maybe that's a bit of a of a choppy example, but I feel like there's probably a lot of us men, specifically, that kind of are probably engaged in levels of benevolent sexism all the time and don't even realize it. Do you think so?
Yeah, I would agree. Yeah, and especially like with our private behavior, I think that's where a lot of things like our sexist, kind of thoughts or racist thoughts are really salient in there, and that's where they're private, where no one has access to them except us. And so we can really kind of say, well, that's not sexist, or I didn't act on this thought, so I wasn't racist.
Right. But the fact that you're still having that thought, I guess that's what that implicit kind of bias piece is it's still there.
Yeah, and I think the key is being aware of when those thoughts come up and how you respond when presented with maybe those situations of, I don't know, like, for instance, and I know we're kind of, now I'm kind of talking about racism, but for instance, if we see someone, like a man of color or a Black man approaching us on the street, coming kind of in the direction that we're walking, and if we clench our personal belongings, well, that's has probably some racist undertones right there, right? Of stereotypes and things like that. So being aware of when we have those thoughts and engage in those behaviors, and monitoring how often we are engaging in those thoughts and behaviors, and trying to identify opportunities where we could do the opposite, be anti-racist or, like you said, anti-sexist.
Totally. Yeah, I mean, I was totally that guy. I would regularly move my wallet from my back pocket to my front pocket when folks were coming towards me. So I totally get that. And it was almost unconscious doing it too. I wasn't even sort of thinking, I might get attacked here, or I might get, mugged or robbed. It was just sort of got to do it, so I get that. Well, before we kind of dive, we're starting to segue into racism. Before we dive into that, you do talk about sort of some things that behavior analysts maybe could do to kind of improve these things. And this kind of starts to fall under that heading of smashing the patriarchy, which is awesome. And one thing you talk about, which I thought was a really great point, was sort of, how we're really lacking in education on kind of equality and consent until you get into university. it's only in university where you can finally take a gender studies course or a women's studies course, or see a group that's talking about, or even have a club or whatever that sort of talks about those things. But prior to that, it's like there's nothing.
Right. Yeah, there's nothing. And I feel like maybe, I don't know, maybe when I was in high school, that was the case. And I don't know if things have changed since then. If now there are maybe clubs that students head in high school, right, that maybe focus on gender equality and things like that. But I think overall, that's not the case.
And I think there are. I know I was working in a high school a year or so ago, and there were sort of groups like sort of like groups in particular to kind of support those that kind of identified as transgender or whatnot. But those groups were just there for those folks to sort of connect with each other and get supports from each other. I don't know that those groups in any way actually provided any education, sort of for the rest of the school. So what are some things? I mean, this is behavior. Your article does a great job talking about shaping and the contingencies in play and kind of, how we kind of got here. What can we do?
Do you mean in the field or in the world?
I think in the world for sure, but I think we got to start in our own field, right? I mean, if we can't clean up our own shop, how are we going to, sort of make suggestions for the rest of the world? Yeah. So I think we need to sort of, deal with our own problems first.
Agreed. I think, and I can't remember if I mentioned this in the article. I feel like if I were to write this article now, it would be written a lot differently. For example, I think I talk more about intersectionality because that's something that I can relate to. But I guess that's beside the point of your question. I think one thing that we can certainly do is, I think all of us to a certain extent have power and privilege. And so, I mean, I think that I've been fed this idea of like, well, I'm a woman of color, so I don't have that much power. But I have a lot of power and privilege. I have a Ph.D. I was born in the US. There's all these things. And so I think one thing that we could do is using our power and access to, certain environments and certain opportunities to bring others along and to empower them, maybe especially women, because I think maybe as women, we have this, or I don't know, maybe if Black, Indigenous people of color maybe have this idea of like, well, I need someone else, in order to succeed. I need access to someone else's environment, when really that's not the case. I think there's having a community is so important. This last year, especially because of the pandemic, I've connected with so many people internationally, and I've broadened my community. And so, we try to empower one another. And so I guess being there as to support one another, being anti-sexist, as you say. So when you see sexism occurring, and I know this is scary because even I'm faced with these situations. I'm like, okay, I know I should say something, but it's scary. I mean, that's normal, right? But moving towards being more vocal about things and, tacting when sexism is occurring. Because if we're not mediating punishment for those things, then it's still going to happen. So I think that's one of the things is using our power to, tackle sexism and, with the language that we use or the assumptions that we make, if we have maybe like a female supervisee or something. I don't know. I read this example recently, and because I had to take a training on discrimination at work of, not just asking women how their families are, but asking everyone, asking men how their families are, because they also will have families, right? You can't assume that just women are mothers, right? Or males can be fathers too, or, anyone of any gender could be a parent. So just being aware of, right, the language that we use, the actions that we engage in. And so, because people are, especially for supervising others, they're seeing that we're modeling that for them. So, and I think that's part of where, this culture this culture of sexism or culture of anything really. So.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And I don't want to get into it, but I because of time, because I do want to touch on this last article. I encourage folks to check out this article in depth because of all the different sort of references to sorts of, to all the other articles that are kind of that now Natalia talks about. There's one in particular that I'm really keen to kind of dive into, where I believe the author is Woolport.
Oh,
or
yes,
Wolpert.
yes.
And is Wolpert a
Yeah, I
woman?
think she is a woman. Yes.
And so she does a feminist analysis of Walden too. I can only imagine what's going to kind of come out of that. So, I think folks really need to kind of check out that piece. I think from what I gather and from your sort of summary, it's not all bad Walden too, but there's definitely some pieces that needed some tweaking in there.
Yeah. Because I know the field worships. Let's just put it plainly, worship Skinner.
Yeah. Absolutely.
And so, Walden 2 was written from his perspective of assumingly, a person who identifies as a male and a heterosexual male. Yep. So, yeah.
There you go. Enough said. That says it all right there. Exactly. We do. And you're right. Our field worships a white heterosexual man, and we often take and people are probably going to write letters, but
I welcome the letters.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, well, me too. But people, I also even just kind of wonder sometimes about sort of Skinner references in general, because no, don't get me wrong. I know he was a researcher, and I know he did some good science. But sometimes we'll reference Skinner when it's just Skinner's opinion,
mm-hmm.
and we'll use that sort of as
mm-hmm.
fact because it was
mm-hmm.
Skinner. But if another guy, if I wrote a paper and said all that stuff and just said it was my idea and didn't reference anybody, I don't think I'd get published.
No, that's publishing for you.
Yeah, so that's there's a lot of Skinnerisms in there that I think folks just need to take with a grain of salt for sure. I appreciate him founding the field, but there's lots more good stuff out there. And the last piece you mentioned in that article, though, which I think is probably another good thing, is this sort of mentorship piece, and really just encouraging, I guess, women who are already, potentially in a position of power, to be mentoring others in kind of, the ways of, sort of, being, I guess, anti-feminist or anti-sexist. Sorry. Is that sort of what that's about? Or
yeah, and I think I also in there too speak about how I think ideally people want to seek mentors who identify with the same identities that they do, and unfortunately that's not always available. So I think in the article I speak about how I guess people who identify as female are also encouraged to seek out mentorship maybe with males, because that could be, I guess, helpful for the type of mentorship that they're seeking. I think of my mentor, an advisor, Dr. Freiling. He identifies as male, and so I feel like he has been one of the people who have really advocated for me. I mentioned to him that I wanted to do a PhD, and at that first time, that first mention, he's like, okay, well, you have to do a thesis because you need that for a PhD to get in. And so he really kind of pushed me and, I think provided me a lot of support. And even though we don't identify with the same gender, I feel like even to this day, I was his student 6 years ago. We still keep in touch. We still work on things. Nice. So, I really value his mentorship, even though we don't identify from the same, with the same gender and race or ethnicity. So.
Sure. Well, and I think that's a great point. And I think that it's not necessary that you get mentorship necessarily from someone with sort of lived experiences with these things. I
Mhm.
mean, not that wouldn't be wonderful,
Mhm.
but also to just get mentorship from folks that, at least have those values,
Yes. Mhm.
and have that perspective and have that understanding of all the things we've talked about already today, and they can be a great mentor
Mhm.
for someone to sort of try to avoid the perils of sexism and whatnot.
Yeah, like, I think, like, seeking mentorship based on function, not on topography, might be helpful.
Nicely put. Yes. Yeah, I like that. I like that. Okay, let's jump into this last article. Do you still have some time to chat
Of
with us?
course.
Awesome. Yeah. For some reason I thought three articles. We'll cruise through these, but there's just a lot of really important pieces here, a little important topics. But before I jump into this, is there anything kind of else related to those? I find this is a sort of a newer area for me as well, and I'm doing a lot of learning myself. Uh, I, I'm wondering if there's any questions maybe I didn't ask about that article that maybe there was some stuff you'd want to add.
Oh, I don't know. I feel like we got through, like, the main kind of chunks of that article,
Okay.
yeah, and to
All
be
right.
honest, it's been,
Cool.
like, a few years since or a year or 2
Fair
since
enough.
I've read it but yeah.
All right. Good. Good.
Mhm.
Good. Good. All right. Well, let's jump into this last one. So, this the final article we're going to talk about is it's titled "On the Importance of Listening and Intercultural Communication for Actions Against Racism." So, this is a great paper. So, we've seen a lot of really good work coming out on racism in general in our field, um, and sort of analyses of that and behavior analytic analyses of that, and there's I did one episode there, talking about sort of empathy training for racism, which was cool.
Mhm.
And so there's some interesting things out there, and there's and a really good background now, I think, of research, and I think there's more coming out every day. um, but what I like about this article in particular is, it's relatively short, it's an easy read, but more to the point, the bulk of this article is action steps that we can take to kind of start to actually do something about kind of racism in our field. So with that in mind, maybe you could start by just telling us why you decided to write this article. The third secret word is hostile.
Sure. So the idea came about. So I was speaking with Dr. Rocker Catroni, who's a co-author on this article,
Hmm.
and I can't remember how we got into this conversation, but I think I remember mentioning how, um, like, for instance, and I'm sure this was seen across the world of, during last summer when the Black Lives Matter movement was with the protests, right, and all those actions were being taken. Like
Hmm.
here in Los Angeles, like in the Hollywood, kind of where the Chinese theater is, there was this big thing on the pavement there that they just kind of painted Black Lives Matter.
Hmm.
And so I think I was telling him how I don't think that like efforts like that are really is what's the solution to racism. They're kind of all
Hmm.
these kind of like performative or topographical actions, right? Of, oh, well, let's just hire
Mm-hmm.
more Black, Indigenous people of color. Let's, all these other things, right? Like with Columbus Day, right? Like let's acknowledge,
Hmm.
right, that it was, I forget the term, but right, Indigenous People Day, is that what it is now? I think. But really, that doesn't really get at the root of racism and the racist
Mm-hmm.
actions. So I think like even with diversity, equity, and inclusion, like that's been a term that's taken off recently. And so I think
Yep.
people might be stuck in the diversity part, but having diversity doesn't mean you automatically get equity and inclusion. Because we can have people who come from diverse backgrounds, right, in a group, but that doesn't mean that they're going to receive the same opportunities or treated the
Mm.
same way just because there's
Yes.
diversity. And so we were speaking about that, and I was saying how historically, right, Black, Indigenous people of color have been telling us what needs to be changed, but it hasn't been done yet. So as listeners, so as people, who aren't part of these communities, we haven't been, from a Skinnerian perspective, ironically, haven't been mediating the reinforcement, right, that these speakers have been requesting, so to speak, from a kind of verbal behavior perspective. So that's where kind of the idea came from.
Yeah, and again, right away, we get cool headings again, and the first one being, the article kind of just starts with a bit of some definitions of racism and whatnot, but the utopia of a quote unquote post-racial society is awesome, and it's so true, because you reference in particular, and I guess this is sort of when this kind of started, is when Barack Obama became president, and sort of the idea, I'm sure in a lot of kind of racist communities, was that racist and generally speaking, racist communities do not identify as racist.
Never, yeah.
So in a lot of these racist communities, just to clarify there, the word was racism is over. There's no racism anymore because we have a Black president now, so we clearly have racial equality. If a Black man can become, can have sort of the most powerful, post, in the country, then clearly we've solved all our problems and it's over. And so I think in a lot of ways that probably caused, certainly in the anti-racist kind of sort of movement, to kind of take a few steps back instead of forwards. Is that?
Yeah, I feel like, with President Barack Obama's, oh my gosh, him becoming president or elected president, people really thought that now the United States wasn't racist anymore, right? But I think that the racism just came out more. And then especially these last 4 years in the US. And I think maybe people might even say that about our current vice president of the United States, with Kamala Harris, we're not sexist anymore. We have a female vice president. No, we can look at how the media has spoken about her, the language that they use to attack, her actions or to describe her.
Yeah.
And so I'm pretty sure the same with President Obama. I think there's just a lot of racist undertones, sexist undertones, respectively, for those two individuals. And so it's become more apparent, instead of what people think is the opposite of we've eradicated these two things.
Absolutely. And yeah, I mean, and I think it kind of goes on to talk about sort of, post-Obama, these, the many names of folks that have been murdered, since Obama, and of course prior to Obama, mostly by police, but but some by other groups as well. Shows that really, really nothing's changed. And why would one assume it had? I mean, that it'd be sort of like saying, random, Black person getting the first job in, I don't know, or a better example might be like, I saw a story recently about a couple of, I think there were high school girls that made the boys football team. And that's amazing and that's awesome, but it didn't eradicate sexism.
Right, yeah.
Why would it make any more of a difference for someone with a lot more, power to get a job and thus suddenly erase everything? But I think that just made for an easy sort of out for these groups to sort of not have to deal with any of this stuff.
Yeah.
So you talk about, this article really talks about kind of the importance of of listening. And so essentially listening, I think essentially this article is all about how how important listening is. So why is listening so important in sort of the sort of the march towards ending racism?
Well, I guess if we're listening from from this verbal behavior kind of Skinnerian perspective, right? Like how we were speaking about a little bit earlier about how a listener in a verbal interaction, they're the ones who mediate the reinforcement of what the speaker is saying. So if we take mands, right, of people asking for things. If I'm the speaker right now and I'm asking you for, I don't know, something, right? I want water. You're the listener in that example. And so your role right there is to maintain my behavior of asking for water is to provide me with water. So I think historically as listeners, we haven't been doing a good job because it's, Black, Indigenous people of color still asking for those reinforcers, and we're not giving it to them. We're just kind of Band-Aid kind of solutions to things of, okay, we'll hire you, that's fine. We'll promote you, that's fine. But that's not really, again, if people aren't being treated with equality and aren't being included, then what's, I don't want diversity, right? We need all three things. It's not just, we can't pick one.
Yes, no, exactly. And so what this brings to sort of the main point of this article is kind of this concept of intercultural communication. And intercultural communication, is exactly what it reads. It's I think as I'm kind of reading through the article is communication between folks of different cultural backgrounds. Nothing crazy or deep or overly complicated about it, and yet it's something that that we struggle with. What are, because it would make sense that if we could have really good intercultural communication and we could listen to the perspectives of folks from different backgrounds and different ethnicities and different languages and different countries and different sort of anything, and really listen and kind of develop those listening skills that and we can start to have some empathy and put ourselves in their shoes and maybe change our behavior. So what's preventing that?
I think you're kind of touching on it, of this lack of maybe perspective taking, or even I think of when we have, when we're speaking about racism, maybe especially with people who identify as Black, Indigenous people of color and people who don't identify, right, with being that, of kind of what's the purpose of having that conversation. I feel like most times, and I've certainly been in these situations where I'm trying to kind of like prove myself or trying to change the other person's, mind about things about racism because they clash with, my perspectives or thoughts on racism. And so instead of the intention being to learn, it's trying to kind of impose our values on other people, if that makes sense. So yeah, I'm sorry, I kind of forgot what your original question was.
No, I think no, it's okay, and I completely get it. I also identify as having ADHD, so I completely understand not connecting with the question and going off on a tangent. So it's actually a fun place to be. But what I think what you're talking about, and again, I'm looking at your article too right now, sounds a lot like this idea of kind of ethnocentrism, and sort of the idea that my perspective of what's going on has to be the right one.
Yeah.
And my perspective of kind of how to interact has to make sense, and yours cannot. I mean, you talked briefly. I don't know if, before we started recording about, or maybe during, but about living that your mom would love to have you sort of
Mhm.
live in the family home until you get
Mhm.
married, and maybe even stay after that. Whereas in predominantly sort of white kind of European centered kind of uh, families, it's when are you turning 18 so you'll leave,
Yeah.
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
And so if I was talking to you, if I was talking to you and I was trying to provide services for your hypothetical adult child with autism,
Mhm.
or adult autistic child, um, um, and the first thing I might say is, well, first we got to get him his own
Yeah.
place, where you might say from a cultural perspective, well, no, we want to keep him for his entire
Yeah.
life. We're collectivist.
Mhm.
We're a collectivist group where,
Mhm.
we'll all gather around and take care of this guy forever. I'm not looking for supports to get him into independent living.
Right.
I'm looking for supports to sort of, embed him in our family, and
Mhm.
so on and so forth. And so, I think that's a piece that when we're listening, we have to really be open to sort of that perspective.
Yeah. Yeah. I think um, being willing to learn and being willing to, I guess, mess up and learn from those mistakes
Yeah.
are huge things that we could just do in general as a field. And I appreciate that like kind of touched on kind of this individualism versus collectivism approach, because I feel
Mm,
like that's something that I've noticed too. I mean, I feel like I grew up, and this might be just culturally in the Latino culture, of there's a lot of it
mm,
emphasizes collectivism,
yeah.
and I don't think that that's really the case for kind of in the U.S. It's more of
Hmm.
I just care about myself and I don't really care about
Hmm.
others. And so I think too that plays a part in how we have conversations or act in relation to racism. Of we should be caring about others, not just ourselves.
Hmm.
Um, because I mean, I want to see other people succeed, right? Like I just, if I am presented with an opportunity, um, we should be kind of evaluating, okay, could someone else maybe benefit from this opportunity? Like, well, I have more
Mm.
opportunities in the future that are similar, you know. So kind of sharing things like that, sharing our power or privilege, right? And all those things.
Yeah, for sure. Well, one of the early episodes I did in the podcast, and I say early like it was years ago, but started this in January. But I think it was episode like 6 or something. It was Addie Carden, and she's a behavior analyst in Senegal,
Hmm.
and she did for her master's thesis. She published a paper that compared the perspectives of parents of autistic kids in the States to the perspectives of parents of autistic kids in Senegal.
Hmm.
And it kind of reminded me of this sort of topic that we're talking about. And I believe they're a kind of a collectivist society as well, because she was saying, you know, um, if you have a kid that sort of, maybe uh, engages in a lot of kind of elopement type behavior,
Hmm.
in the States, you know, right away it would be 911, missing person,
Hmm.
search and rescue, the cavalry has to come in and save this kid because, he's likely, something really bad has happened. And she said in Senegal, completely different story. In Senegal, you know, the kid goes off missing, shows up at someone else's house, that person just opens the door and lets
Hmm.
them in,
Yeah.
and they just hang out there for the day. And eventually someone might say Billy's over here,
Hmm.
but anyone in the community would be willing to look after that child,
Hmm.
and so there was never a worry about him getting lost, because wherever he went, someone would accept him. And I just love that sort of perspective of but again, if you didn't know those sorts of pieces,
Hmm.
you'd come in and you'd make suggestions, or give advice or whatever that was very centered on your own perspective.
Yeah, and I'm sorry that I don't want to deviate too much from, I know, like the question that we're actually
I love deviating. Go for it. Deviate away.
Because I was just and I think I've mentioned this publicly before, of how maybe kind of in recent years I was reflecting on how I supervised services when I was, working as a clinician, and how even though I was working with Spanish speaking immigrant families, I was born in the US, and so I have a lot of kind of how I was raised all has the Latino, kind of culture and the US based culture. And so I would be recommending kind of like what you're saying, of like trying to increase independence for my client, and how that probably wasn't what the family wanted for their child. And so again, even though I came from like a similar background or population,
right.
I have different experiences, and so I need to be.
Yes.
We all need to be aware of those things. Of
Yes.
Imposing. If our values don't match, we need to be. What am I trying to say? I guess like making services accessible and accommodating for all those cultural values, and not trying to impose our own. With the families we work with. Yeah.
I like that, and it's kind of makes you think of kind of what's happening here right now in Canada. So, for us, it's been in terms of sort of racism and whatnot. I mean, certainly we have, a lot of the similar issues that you see in the States. Our population is 1/10 of yours, so we just don't have as many news stories about it. But the big sort of topic right now, and hopefully not just right now and continues forever, is reconciliation with our First Nation communities. Because we, and for folks, I think the folks in the States are starting to pick up on this now too. But the whole sort of residential school experience and the atrocities that occurred there, and we're talking about something like 150,000 children. Like, it's a ridiculously high number of kids that, and so far something like 8,000 graves have been sort of uncovered already. It's awful stuff. But anyway, we're really trying to do a lot of work in kind of that area in terms of reconciliation. And as it sort of applies to sort of our work as behavior analysts, it's often a lot of Indigenous children that are in the social services sort of in the system, and that Indigenous children in foster care are highly overrepresented. I think it's something like 8% of the kids demographically are Indigenous, but 56% of them are in foster care. So some awful number like that. And that foster care has just really become, in a lot of ways, an extension of residential schools and another way to sort of, rip the kids away. That's a bit of a background to the point of what we've been trying to do, what I think what the approach has been sort of, okay, no, well, let's try to connect more with First Nations, and and we have, Billy in this foster home, in Village A, and there's a First Nation around the corner. Let's go to that First Nation and see if we can, build some relationships and try to bring some culture into Billy's life. And on the cover, that sounds like just a great plan and a really, forward-thinking, culturally humble sort of a way of kind of doing things. When in fact, it's totally another example of the story you just told, because every single First Nation community is so different from the other. Like it's not just the fact that they're all Indigenous, but they speak completely different languages. The customs are completely different. The ceremonies are completely different. The sort of elder responsibilities are different. Even the hierarchical system of sort of running the village is different. And so to sort of make the assumption that we can just go to any First Nations village and start our community and start, building relationships, and that'll solve all our problems for those particular kids, is so far off. And so I really appreciate that perspective.
Yeah, and I feel like the same can kind of apply for at least like people who identify as Hispanic or Latino. Of like, I don't know. I mean, still to this day, people assume that I am Mexican, and it's not that I have a problem with being identified as Mexican. It's the fact that people just generalize, right, and just assume that, okay, especially I think here in Los Angeles, like there's a huge Mexican population. But there's also a big Central American population, and I mean, on the East Coast, right? Like in New York, there's a lot of Puerto Ricans and people from the Dominican Republic, and so, we're all not just tacos and tequila. We come from different countries, and the countries in the Caribbean. Like there are, people who speak Spanish that are Black or have African roots. Right. And so it's not just people with brown skin and black hair, like in Mexico and other parts of Latin America, people with blonde hair, blue eyes, right, or who don't speak Spanish. Like people in Brazil, they speak Portuguese, and they're part of Latin America.
Right.
So there's that too. Yeah.
Well, yeah, and I think especially like I get that. Like, I mean, when I was a kid, I thought every sort of Latinx person was Mexican. That was the assumption, because there was no country south of Mexico,
right?
Right.
Yep.
There was nothing going on in the world beyond Mexico, because it's the country that borders, whatever. But since then, I've been lucky enough to have the opportunity to travel a bit in Central America. And spent a couple months down in Ecuador, and super different, from place to place, and like just night and day differences that from both sort of present day, but also the history. Just even the looking at some of the old structures and how they differ sort of from kind of country to country. So, I mean, there's a wide amount of diversity, but yeah, it's really easy to sort of just lump someone in a category.
Yeah. And I guess one more thing on this, because I don't want to just kind of glaze over the fact that we also have indigenous populations in Latin America, right? And they also speak their own languages. They don't just speak Spanish. And so we have those populations as well.
Yeah, and that's something that was really cool for me when I went to Ecuador. Was spent a lot of time with a lot of the indigenous folk, and sort of just the way. And now I wasn't speaking Spanish, and I still don't, and so maybe I missed a lot of bits, but it really seemed like sort of the acceptance of the way of living of the indigenous folk down there was so much different than it is sort of up our way. Just the sort of the I guess I don't know I don't know what the term I'm looking for is, but and I think part of it was also related to sort of the class system too. I think there was no middle class in Ecuador. It was sort of, I think that's the case for a lot of kind of some of those countries in sort of South America and Central America. You have ultra rich and ultra poor, and sort of no one in between. But the ultra poor outnumber the ultra rich by like 1,000-fold. And they're living in homes and sort of communities that a privileged white guy like me might describe as disgusting slum, right? But for them, they're happy, because we kind of got to tour those households and visit it was through kind of a Rotary sort of related thing. So we're visiting families and just seeing the joy and the happiness and the and the ability to sort of make do with so little, and even I went to an autism intervention kind of program in Quito, and it was it was sort of a special education kind of program. This was what it was. I went to a group. I went to those two things, but I also went to a group home, and I work a lot in group homes for adults with developmental disabilities. And it was and I'm totally digressing, I know. It was a concrete, roofless building, roofless, windowless structure in the middle of a jungle, with dirt floors. and these people were as happy as I've ever seen anyone living in a group home. The materials for communication, were literally hand-drawn figurines on pieces on bark or pieces of paper. So the reason there's no board maker or or laminators and Velcro, and yet, it would have been so easy to make judgments about these folks, but yet they were, so much more happier and so much more just in the game than, any $1 million program that I've ever been involved in. And it was just really cool.
Yeah, I feel like that kind of relates to what I said earlier about for them that functionally that worked for them, even though topographically we would say that would never work, but it does for them.
Yeah. No, exactly. So kind of getting into probably what could be the second longest podcast episode I've ever done. Addie Carden, actually, in Senegal, she was the longest. I think we clocked 2 1/4, just because the conversation was so interesting. And clearly this one is too, and that's why we're just going and going. And I could keep going for longer, but I know I promised you your freedom 17 minutes ago.
It's fine. We're good.
So, but I will just say for folks, check out the rest of that article. There are some just really some of it kind of relatively obvious, I think, steps around listening. So, the sort of things that you need to be kind of thinking about. So caution regarding multitasking. I mentioned that at the beginning of the episode, so don't be on your phone while you're having a conversation with somebody, but I think it's just sort of having that sort of full kind of presence and attention towards folks. Avoid that listener interjection, which is really important. And I just finished Scott Herbst's Supervising Dynamically course, and he talks a lot about interjection and not adding more to the conversation than is already there, and to really be empathic. Don't make suggestions on what you think is happening.
Right.
Just repeat the facts and that's it. Those sorts of things. You talk about. I think the two other pieces you talk about. One, I think that we're touching a little bit on sort of language differences, having that patience during language discrepancies. I thought that was a really important one, just particularly when it comes to sort of idioms and phrase and different phrases and that sort of thing, but also just general kind of maybe. For folks maybe that are speaking English as a second language, they might make some quote unquote mistakes when they're speaking, and it's really easy to sort of take someone who's, speaking English as a second or third or fourth language, and that alone, I mean, the fact that this person speaks 3 other languages fluently and you don't speak any, and yet you're judging them on the quality of their English,
right.
and also potentially even judging their IQ and their ability to sort of function in life based on their skills at English. And so I think that's a really important point that you brought up.
Yeah, I mean, I consider myself as my primary language is English, even though I think when I was growing up, my primary language was Spanish, and then it switched when I went to school. But even now, I'm sure, I don't know how many times throughout this conversation I've been I forget what word, or, I'm trying to think of so I mean, we all have difficulties with that sometimes. So,
and in fact, it's actually for some folks that's actually a diagnosable brain injury called expressive aphasia, where you literally can't come up with words for things. I have a relative that has it, and and they struggle just because the word just isn't there. And so just being aware of those sorts of pieces. The last comment that you made, the last recommendation that you made, is maybe you could just touch on this one a tiny bit, because I think this one isn't as simple, and it's welcoming difficult conversations. It's easy enough to say don't multitask. It's easier enough to say don't add anything to the conversation. It's easy enough to say recognize that their grasp on your language may not be perfect, but give them a break. But this part, I think, is probably the hardest.
Yeah, agreed.
How do you do that?
and I think this is where maybe ACT can come in. because as humans, we just tend to avoid kind of aversive stimuli. And so this could be considered an aversive stimulus or aversive situation of having conversations about racism, sexism, right? Whatever it may be. But so I guess maybe pulling from ACT is if that's a value of someone's is to be anti-racist or be anti-sexist, we need to kind of welcome those difficult or aversive stimuli, right? Because that will get us, if we behave in that way, it's in alignment with what we value. And sometimes those situations means, right, them being aversive. And so don't think of the journey, think of the destination.
Sure.
But yeah, I mean, I struggle with this too. I mean, I'm sure like people will probably say, oh my gosh, like these three authors just do all these things all the time. I mean, I certainly don't. I think like life in general is just about learning. And you have to be comfortable with the uncomfortable. And like we all are gonna mess up sometimes, and that's gonna happen. But what matters is that we learn from those mess ups, and are receptive to people telling us, hey, you messed up. And okay, well, how can I not mess up in the future?
Yeah, no, I think that's what I was kind of wondering. Is it's just, and you kind of hit the nail on the head right there with the the discomfort piece, because we've been hearing a lot, sort of, again, sort of post George Floyd, from folks even particularly in our field, around the importance of sitting with the discomfort. And being open to sort of, you're going to hear a bunch of new things. You're going to be told a bunch of things that you could take offense to, but instead just sit with it, because that's part of the learning process. And that was such a huge lesson for me. I now know whenever I'm having a conversation, and I've had quite a few moments of discomfort in our conversation today, I will say, that I used to sort of associate that discomfort with, I'm doing something wrong. I must have said something wrong. I was a bad person, I've offended or whatever. And maybe those things are true. But and of course, then there's responses for that as well, of course, to acknowledge and apologize and so on. But just sort of realizing that when I'm having a conversation with someone, particularly someone that might be a person of color, and we're talking about topics like racism, or even if we're just talking period, about anything, and maybe I get a shot of implicit bias in my head or whatever, or they say something that clearly applies to me and everyone in sort of my my identity group or whatnot, that feeling in my gut isn't a bad thing. And I think in a way, I never used ACT, but I think in a way I've kind of maybe taken some acceptance there, and and kind of realized that's a good thing that I'm feeling weird in my gut, and that means I'm learning something new, and I'm learning it in a different way, and I should be embracing that, not pushing it away.
Yeah. And I guess if I can make like a recommendation for listeners of a book. And I cannot remember how to pronounce the author's name, so I'm just going to spell it out. So the first name is IJEOMA, and then her last name is OLUO, and her book is titled So You Want to Talk About Race. I am part of the Southern California chapter of the Association for Contextual Behavior Science board. And I am a board member at large with a DEI focus, so a diversity, equity, inclusion focus. And so we have, I started this book club that's a DEI focused book club. And I picked this book.
Cool.
And we read this book. And she provides a lot of like actual actions that people can take. And I read this book and I marked it all up with like notes and trying to connect it to behavior analysis. And so I think like a book like this, if people are really interested and this is a value of theirs of being anti-racist, they should read this book.
Awesome.
I really love it. She even gives, I forget, like she just gives a bunch of recommendations of, you know, when you're talking to someone about racism, like how do you, like, I forget exactly like the, you know, kind of like this situations. But, or like she says like, oh, if someone says this is what you can say back, you know, kind of those kinds of things.
Right. Okay. Gotcha. Right. Very good.
Yeah. So I absolutely love this book. So, and I recommend it to everyone.
Wicked. Well, great recommendation. Thank you. I'll see if I can dig it up myself. Awesome. Cool. Well, this is good. I think we'll stop here. You know, again, we could easily jump into hour 3. And this is a topic that could go on for a while, but I don't want everyone to press stop and not listen to the whole thing. Really, really great kind of work you've done so far. I'm sure there's going to be lots more really interesting works coming out, and hopefully we can have you on the podcast again. I really enjoyed this conversation, so thanks so much.
Oh yeah, no, thanks for reaching out and for, you know, seeing the value in my work. I really appreciate it.
No worries. It's there. Yeah. Wicked. All right. Thanks again.
All right, thank you.